In gesture to Israel, Saudi Arabia opens airspace. Saudi Arabia has announced lifting of restrictions on all carriers using its airspace, an apparent gesture of openness towards Israel ahead of US President Biden's arrival for talks.
This decision is the result of the president's persistent and principled diplomacy with Saudi Arabia over many months, culminating in his visit today,
said Jake Sullivan, US National Security Advisor. US plans to counter China's reach in Middle East. At a multilateral summit, held online with Israel, India, and the UAE, President Biden discussed several investment projects, as the US sought to counter the global reach of China.
I want to make clear that we can continue to lead in the region and not create a vacuum that is filled by China and/or Russia, against the interest of both Israel and the United States, and many other countries,
said Joe Biden, President of the United States. Biden raises issue of attack on Saudi dissidents. US President Joe Biden said he had confronted Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman over attacks on dissidents during his visit to Saudi Arabia.
What happened to Khashoggi was outrageous. I just made it clear if anything occurs like that again they will get that response and much more,
said Joe Biden, President of the United States. US will not walk away from Middle East. US President Joe Biden told Arab leaders that Washington would remain fully engaged in the Middle East and would not cede influence to other world powers.
We will not walk away and leave a vacuum to be filled by China, Russia, or Iran,
said Joe Biden, President of the United States. Tehran capable of making nuclear bomb. Tehran is technically capable of making a nuclear bomb but has yet to decide whether to build one, said a senior advisor to Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
In a few days we were able to enrich uranium up to 60% and we can easily produce 90% enriched uranium. Iran has the technical means to produce a nuclear bomb, but there has been no decision by Iran to build one,
said Kamal Karazi, senior advisor to Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Biden vows to use all power to stop Iran's atomic bomb. US and Israel have signed a new security pact reinforcing their common front against Iran as President Biden vowed to use all American power to stop Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
The only thing that will stop Iran is knowing that if they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force,
said Yair Lapid, Israeli Prime Minister.
Any mistake made in this region will be met with a harsh and regrettable response,
said Ibrahim Raisi, President of Iran. Russian missile strike kills 23 in Ukraine's Vinnytsia. Russian missiles struck Vinnytsia in central Ukraine, killing at least 23 people including 3 children, in what President Volodymyr Zelensky called an open act of terrorism.
Every day, Russia kills civilians, kills Ukrainian children, carries out missile attacks on the civilian facilities where there is no military target. What is this, if not an open act of terrorism? I believe it is inevitable that International Criminal Court will bring accountability to those guilty of crimes under its jurisdiction, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide,
said Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine. EU slams Russian attack on Ukraine's Vinnytsia. The EU strongly condemned what it called an atrocity after Russian missiles struck Vinnytsia in central Ukraine, killing at least 23 people including 3 children.
This atrocity in Vinnytsia is the latest in a long series of brutal attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. There can be no impunity for violations and crimes committed by the Russian forces and their political superiors,
said a statement issued by Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and Janez Lenarčič, European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management. Russia preparing for next stage of offensive. Russia is preparing for the next stage of its offensive in Ukraine, a Ukrainian military official has said, after Moscow said its forces would step up military operations.
It is not only missile strikes from the air and sea. We can see shelling along the entire line of contact, along the entire front line. There is an active use of tactical aviation and attack helicopters. Clearly preparations are now underway for the next stage of the offensive,
said Vadim Skibitsky, spokesman for Ukrainian military intelligence. EU to target Russian gold in sanctions. The EU will target Russian gold exports in its next sanction package and seek to close exit routes for those bypassing its earlier packages.
The EU will look into ways we could slap a sanction regime on gold, which is an important commodity for exports from Russia. As soon as we reach an agreement at the level of member states, we will publish it,"
said Maro Sefcovic, Vice President of the European Commission. US, Russia to resume space station flights. Despite attempts to isolate the country over its invasion of Ukraine, the US has said it would resume flights to the International Space Station with Russia.
To ensure continued safe operations of the International Space Station, protect the lives of astronauts and ensure continuous US presence in space, NASA will resume integrated crews on US Crew spacecraft and the Russian Soyuz. The station was designed to be interdependent and relies on contributions from each space agency to function. No one agency has the capability to function independent of the others,
said a statement by US space agency NASA. Refusal to recognize Crimea, a threat. The refusal of Ukraine and NATO powers to recognize Moscow's authority over Crimea represents a systemic threat for Russia, says former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev.
If any other state, be it Ukraine or NATO countries, believes that Crimea is not Russian, then this is a systemic threat for us. This is a direct and an explicit threat, especially given what had happened to Crimea. Crimea returned to Russia,
said Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president and now deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council. Wishful thinking, says UK military chief on Putin's health. The head of Britain's armed forces has dismissed as wishful thinking speculation that Russian President Vladimir Putin is suffering from ill health or could be assassinated.
"I think some of the comments that he's not well or that actually surely somebody's going to assassinate him or take him out, I think they are wishful thinking. As military professionals, we see a relatively stable regime in Russia. President Putin has been able to quash any opposition. We see a hierarchy that is invested in President Putin, and so nobody at the top has got the motivation to challenge President Putin. And that is bleak,"
said Admiral Tony Radakin, Chief of the Defense Staff of the United Kingdom. Ukraine grain blockade could starve thousands. The EU has warned that Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports threatens grain supplies to tens of thousands of people vulnerable to starvation.
"It's an issue of life and death for many human beings. And the question is that Russia has to deblock and allow Ukrainian grain to be exported,"
said Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Dalai Lama says India and China must talk. Tibetan spiritual leader the Dalai Lama has said that India and China must solve the border dispute through talks and peaceful means.
"India and China are both competitive nations and neighbors. Sooner or later you have to solve this problem through talks and peaceful means. The use of military force is outdated. Not Chinese people, but some Chinese hardliners consider me a separatist. Now, more and more Chinese are realizing that Dalai Lama is not seeking independence, but within China meaningful autonomy to preserve Tibetan Buddhist culture,"
said Tibetan spiritual leader the Dalai Lama. US House votes for India sanctions waiver. The US House of Representatives passed a legislative amendment approving waiver to India against punitive Qatar sanctions for its purchase of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia.
The US must stand with India in the face of escalating aggression from China. As Vice Chair of the India Caucus, I have been working to strengthen the partnership between our countries and ensure that India can defend itself,
said Ro Khanna, US Congressman, Democratic Party. World democracy and freedom under assault. Britain's Prince Harry told the UN that the overturning of constitutional rights in the United States was part of a global assault on democracy and freedom.
"This has been a painful year in a painful decade. And from the horrific war in Ukraine to the rolling back of constitutional rights here in the United States, we are witnessing a global assault on democracy and freedom, the cause of Mandela's life,"
said Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex in an address at the United Nations General Assembly in New York at an event marking Nelson Mandela International Day.